The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in Cedar Falls, Iowa, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud and the sky into a permanent shade of gray. It was the kind of rain that made people stay inside, that made them forget the sun had ever existed. But for 10-year-old Mason Cooper, the rain was a blessing. It meant his stepfather, Frank, would stay in his chair longer, drinking his beer and watching television, instead of finding reasons to punish him. Mason pressed his forehead against the cold window of his bedroom, watching the droplets race down the glass. His breath fogged the surface, and he drew a small heart with his finger before quickly wiping it away. Hearts were for kids who had mothers to tuck them in at night, and Mason's mother had been gone for 2 years now. Cancer, they had said. The word had meant nothing to him at the time. Now it meant everything. The house creaked and groaned around him like a living thing. It was an old farmhouse on the edge of town, the kind of place that had once been full of laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Mason could still remember when his grandmother was alive, how she would bake cookies every Sunday and let him lick the bowl. But Grandma had passed away 6 months after his mother, and Frank had inherited everything, including Mason. Downstairs, the television blared loudly, some kind of sports game. Mason could hear Frank yelling at the screen, his voice rough from cigarettes and anger. The boy flinched at every shout, even though he knew they weren't directed at him, not yet anyway. The night was still young. Mason was small for his age, with sandy brown hair that fell into his eyes and a collection of faded bruises that he had become an expert at hiding. He wore long sleeves even in summer and had learned to lie so convincingly that his teachers never suspected anything. He told them he was clumsy, that he fell a lot. They believed him because it was easier than asking questions. The rain intensified, pounding against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Mason wished he could be carried away by it, swept up in the flood and deposited somewhere far from here. Somewhere safe, but 10-year-old boys didn't get wishes granted. Not in Cedar Falls, not anywhere. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the stale crackers he had found in the pantry that morning. Frank didn't believe in regular meals for kids. He said it built character, made them tough. Mason didn't feel tough. He felt hollow, like the old scarecrow in the cornfield behind the house. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made Mason's heart seize in his chest. He quickly moved away from the window and sat on his bed, trying to look busy with the tattered book he had read 100 times. It was about a boy who ran away to sea and had adventures. Mason had memorized every word, every illustration. It was his escape when he couldn't physically leave. The door swung open without a knock. Frank filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the hallway light. He was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, with hands like meat hooks and eyes that never seemed to have any warmth in them. He had been handsome once, Mason's mother had said, back when they first met, but alcohol and bitterness had eroded whatever attractiveness he had possessed. "What are you doing up here?" Frank's voice was slurred, the words sliding into each other. "Just reading, sir." Mason kept his eyes on the book, not daring to look up. "Reading." Frank spat the word like it was something dirty. "Your mother was always reading too. Look where that got her." Mason bit his tongue so hard he tasted blood. He had learned that responding only made things worse. Silence was his shield, even if it wasn't always effective. Frank swayed in the doorway for a moment, as if deciding whether Mason was worth the effort. Then he grunted and turned away. "Get to sleep. You're cleaning out the shed tomorrow. I don't care if it's still raining." The door slammed shut and Mason let out the breath he had been holding. He waited until he heard Frank's footsteps retreat down the stairs before allowing himself to tremble. The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down his cheeks in rivers that mimicked the rain outside. He didn't know how much longer he could do this. The social worker had come once, after a teacher noticed a particularly bad bruise on his arm. But Frank had been charming, full of apologies and explanations. He had talked about how difficult it was raising a boy alone, how Mason was troubled and prone to accidents. The social worker had nodded sympathetically and left. never to return. That night, Frank had taught Mason a lesson about telling lies to teachers. Mason hadn't been able to sit comfortably for a week. The next morning dawned grey and wet, exactly as Mason had expected. He dressed quickly in the cold room, pulling on his worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had once belonged to his father. His real father, not Frank. Mason couldn't remember much about him. Just a warm laugh and the smell of sawdust. He had been a carpenter, his mother had said, the best in 3 counties. But he had died in a car accident when Mason was 3 years old. Mason crept downstairs, avoiding the 3rd step that always squeaked. Frank was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that was more whiskey than caffeine. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face was covered in grey stubble. "There's the shed," Frank said without looking up. "I want it cleaned by noon." "Yes, sir." Mason grabbed a piece of bread from the counter, not daring to put anything on it. He shoved it in his pocket for later and headed out the back door into the rain. The cold hit him like a slap, soaking through his thin shirt within seconds, but he didn't go back for a jacket. That would mean facing Frank again, and he had already pushed his luck for the morning. The shed was at the back of the property, a ramshackle building that leaned precariously to one side. It was full of old farm equipment, broken furniture, and memories that Frank wanted erased. Mason knew that some of the things in there had belonged to his grandmother, maybe even his mother. Frank was probably planning to sell them, turn everything into more money for beer. Mason worked steadily, sorting through the debris with numb fingers. The rain leaked through the gaps in the roof, creating muddy puddles on the dirt floor. He found an old photograph wedged behind a broken chest of drawers, and his heart nearly stopped. It was his mother, young and beautiful, standing in front of this very shed. She was laughing at something off camera, her eyes bright with joy. Mason couldn't remember ever seeing her look that happy. He slipped the photograph into his pocket, next to the bread. It was his now, a piece of her that Frank couldn't take away. He would hide it under his mattress with the other small treasures he had salvaged over the years. A button from her favorite dress, a dried flower from her funeral, a birthday card she had written him when he turned 8. By noon, the shed was as clean as it was going to get. Mason's hands were raw and bleeding from handling the rusty metal and splintered wood. His clothes were soaked through, and he couldn't feel his toes. But he had done what Frank asked, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep the peace for one more day. He trudged back to the house, leaving muddy footprints on the porch. Frank was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed over his chest. For one horrible moment, Mason thought he had done something wrong, that the shed wasn't clean enough or he had taken too long. But Frank just grunted and jerked his head toward the stairs. "Go change. You're dripping everywhere." Mason didn't need to be told twice. He fled to his room, stripping off his wet clothes and pulling on the only other outfit he owned. The bread in his pocket was soggy, but he ate it anyway, savoring each bite. His stomach cramped from the sudden intake of food, but the pain was almost pleasant. At least it reminded him he was still alive. That night, Frank went out. He did that sometimes, disappearing for hours to the bar in town. Mason learned to treasure those nights, the rare occasions when he could move through the house without fear, when he could pretend he was normal. He made himself a sandwich from the bread and the last of the lunch meat in the refrigerator. He found an old can of soup in the pantry and heated it on the stove, careful not to leave any evidence. Frank noticed everything, counted every crumb, and Mason had been punished before for eating more than his share. After dinner, he sat in the living room with the television turned low, watching a program about trucks. He was fascinated by the massive vehicles, the way they rumbled down the highway with their loads of cargo. The drivers seemed like heroes to him, modern-day cowboys crossing the plains. He dreamed sometimes of stowing away in one of those trucks, riding it all the way to California or Florida or somewhere else that wasn't here. The program showed a trucker delivering supplies to a town that had been hit by a tornado. The man was big and bearded, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He talked about how driving was in his blood, how he loved seeing the country and helping people along the way. Mason felt a longing so intense it made his chest ache. What would it be like to have a father like that? Someone who smiled and talked about loving their work. Someone who helped people instead of hurting them. The question haunted him long after the program ended, and he retreated to his room. He lay in bed, listening for Frank's truck, counting the minutes until his stepfather returned, and the fragile peace shattered once again. A week passed, then two. The rain stopped, replaced by a stubborn cold that turned the puddles into sheets of ice. Mason walked to school each morning, 1.5 miles down country roads that wound through fields of dead corn. The other kids on the bus waved as they passed, but none of them stopped to offer him a ride. He was the weird kid, the one who lived with the mean drunk out on Miller Road. Nobody wanted to get involved with that. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the way he flinched whenever someone moved too quickly. She asked him if everything was okay at home, and Mason recited the lies he had rehearsed so many times. Everything was fine. He just hadn't been sleeping well. He was clumsy, always tripping over things. Mrs. Patterson didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. The way she watched him during class, the way she found excuses to keep him after school. She gave him extra food from her own lunch, granola bars and apples that she said she couldn't finish. Mason accepted them gratefully, hiding them in his backpack to eat later when he was alone. One afternoon she asked him to stay after the final bell. The other students filed out, their laughter echoing down the hall. Mason stood by her desk, his heart pounding. Had he done something wrong? Was she going to call Frank? "Mason," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "I want you to know that if there's ever anything you need to tell me, I'm here to listen. No judgment, no consequences, just someone who cares about you." Mason stared at his shoes. They were too small, pinching his toes, but Frank refused to buy him new ones. He wanted to tell her everything, to spill his secrets like water from a cracked cup. But he remembered what had happened last time. The social worker who believed Frank's lies, the punishment that followed. He couldn't go through that again. "I'm fine," he whispered. "Really?" Mrs. Patterson sighed, but she didn't push. She simply pressed another granola bar into his hand and told him to be safe. Mason nodded and fled, not trusting himself to speak. That night, Frank was in a good mood. He had gotten some money from somewhere, probably selling more of Grandma's things, and he ordered pizza for dinner. Mason ate 3 slices, more than he had eaten in days, while Frank talked about his plans to fix up the house and sell it. "We'll move to the city," Frank said, his eyes glazed with alcohol and dreams. "Get a nice apartment. Start over. You'd like that, wouldn't you, boy?" Mason nodded, not believing a word of it. Frank had been making plans for as long as he could remember, grand schemes that never went anywhere. The money always disappeared into bottles and lottery tickets, and the house fell further into disrepair with each passing year. But for one evening, there was peace. Mason went to bed with a full stomach and a heart that was almost light. Maybe things would get better. Maybe Frank would change. Maybe miracles did happen. The miracle lasted exactly 1 day. Mason didn't know what set Frank off that Saturday morning. Maybe it was the bills that had been piling up on the kitchen table. Maybe it was the call from his boss at the construction site telling him not to bother coming back. Maybe it was simply the weight of his own miserable life pressing down on him until something had to give. Whatever the reason, Frank erupted like a volcano that had been dormant too long. The rage was familiar, but its intensity was not. Mason saw it building in his stepfather's eyes, the redness spreading across his face, the veins bulging in his temples. He knew he should run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He stood frozen in the kitchen like a rabbit in the headlights of an oncoming truck. The first blow knocked him off his feet. The second drove the air from his lungs. Mason curled into a ball on the cold linoleum, covering his head with his arms as Frank's boot found his ribs again and again. He didn't cry out. He had learned long ago that crying only made Frank angrier. So he stayed silent, absorbing the pain until the world went grey at the edges and he couldn't feel anything anymore. When he woke, the house was quiet. Frank was gone, probably to the bar or to wherever he went to cool down after these episodes. Mason lay still for a long time, taking inventory of his injuries. Nothing seemed broken, but his ribs screamed with every breath, and his left eye was swollen shut. He would need to come up with a good story for this one, maybe a fall from the hayloft, or a fight with some kids from school. He pulled himself up slowly, using the counter for support. The kitchen was a mess, chairs overturned and dishes shattered on the floor. He began cleaning automatically, his hands moving through the motions while his mind floated somewhere far away. This was survival, nothing more. He didn't think about the future because there didn't seem to be one. He just moved from one moment to the next, existing. That night, huddled in his bed with an ice pack pressed against his ribs, Mason made a decision. He couldn't stay here anymore. He couldn't wait for Frank to kill him or for the social workers who never came. He had to save himself because nobody else was going to do it. He would run away. He would find one of those trucks from the television and hitch a ride to somewhere else, anywhere else. He would become someone new, someone without a stepfather who hated him or a mother who was buried in the cemetery on the hill. He would start over. The plan took shape in his mind over the next few days. He would need supplies, food, water, warm clothes. He would need money, though he had no idea where to get it. He would need to pick the right moment, when Frank was gone and the roads were clear. He would need luck, and that was something he had been short on his entire life. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Mason felt something stirring in his chest. It took him a while to recognize it, because it had been so long since he had experienced it. Hope, fragile and foolish perhaps, but hope nonetheless. The truck stop on Highway 20 was about 5 miles from the farmhouse, just past the grain elevator and the abandoned drive-in movie theater. Mason had seen it from the school bus window, a sprawling complex of fuel pumps and parking lots where the big rigs gathered like dinosaurs at a watering hole. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where people came and went without leaving traces. Mason studied the truck stop for a week before making his move. He walked there after school one day, telling Frank he had to stay late for a project. The lie came easily now, almost without thought. He spent an hour watching the trucks pull in and out, memorizing the routines, identifying the drivers who looked kind and those who looked mean. There was one trucker who caught his attention. He was a big man, maybe 50 years old, with a grey beard and a flannel shirt stretched tight over his barrel chest. His truck was a gleaming red Peterbilt, kept cleaner than any vehicle Mason had ever seen. The name on the side read, Mitchell Transport, in gold letters that caught the light. The man moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who had learned patience from the road. He checked his tires and his lights, filled his tank, and bought coffee from the convenience store. He smiled at the cashier and held the door for an old woman struggling with her bags. He seemed like someone who had time for people, who didn't rush through life leaving wreckage in his wake. Mason made up his mind. If he was going to trust anyone, it would be this man. He just had to wait for the right moment. That moment came on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after Frank's worst outburst. Mason woke before dawn, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. He had packed his backpack the night before, 2 changes of clothes, the photograph of his mother, the treasures from under his mattress, a water bottle, and as much food as he could smuggle from the kitchen without Frank noticing. Frank was passed out on the couch, an empty bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. Mason tiptoed past him, hardly daring to breathe. The screen door squeaked as he pushed it open, and he froze, waiting for the sound of Frank waking. But there was only silence and the distant call of a crow. The walk to the truck stop took over an hour. The sun was just rising when Mason arrived, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The parking lot was already half full, trucks idling as their drivers grabbed breakfast and prepared for the long haul ahead. Steam rose from the vehicles like breath on a cold morning. Mason scanned the lot, searching for the red Peterbilt. For a terrible moment, he thought it wasn't there, that the trucker had already left or had taken a different route. But then he spotted it, parked in the back corner near the fence. The chrome gleamed in the early light, and Mason could see movement in the cab. He approached slowly, his hands shoved in his pockets to hide their trembling. His backpack felt impossibly heavy, weighted down with everything he had in the world. The closer he got to the truck, the more his courage faltered. What was he doing? This man was a stranger. He could be just as bad as Frank or worse. Mason had no way of knowing, but he kept walking because the alternative was turning around and going back to the farmhouse, back to Frank, and the endless cycle of fear and pain. That wasn't living. That was just waiting to die. The trucker was sitting in the driver's seat, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He looked up as Mason approached, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Up close, his face was weathered and kind, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. "Well, hello there," the trucker said. His voice was deep and gentle, like distant thunder. "You're up early for a young fellow." Mason's mouth was dry. All the speeches he had rehearsed vanished from his mind, leaving nothing but terror and desperation. He stood there, frozen, staring up at this stranger who held his fate in calloused hands. "You okay, son?" The trucker set down his newspaper and leaned forward, concern evident in his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mason swallowed hard. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could think about the consequences. "Can you save me from my stepdad?" The question hung in the cold morning air. The trucker's expression shifted, cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like pain. He studied Mason for a long moment, taking in the fading bruises, the haunted eyes, the backpack that contained a child's entire life. "What's your name, son?" he asked finally. "Mason. Mason Cooper." "I'm Ray. Ray Mitchell." The trucker opened his door and climbed down from the cab, moving slowly so as not to startle the boy. He was even bigger up close, towering over Mason like a friendly giant. "How about you tell me what's going on?" And so Mason told him everything. The words poured out like water from a broken dam, all the secrets he had kept hidden for so long. He told Ray about his mother and her cancer, about Frank and his drinking, about the beatings and the hunger, and the terrible loneliness of being 10 years old, with nobody in the world who cared if he lived or died. Ray listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each revelation. When Mason finished, the trucker was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, handing it to the boy. "Dry your eyes," he said gruffly. "Can't have you crying all over my clean truck." Mason hadn't even realized he was crying. He wiped his face, embarrassed and relieved at the same time. He had told someone. For better or worse, he had told someone. "Here's what we're going to do," Ray said, his voice taking on a decisive tone. "You're going to get in my truck and have some breakfast. Then we're going to figure out how to help you properly. But I'm not taking you anywhere until we do this right. You understand?" Mason nodded, not entirely sure what doing this right meant, but willing to trust this stranger who had listened without judgment. Ray helped him into the cab, which was surprisingly comfortable. The interior was decorated with photographs and small mementos from the road, a dream catcher hanging from the rear-view mirror, a faded baseball cap on the dashboard, a well-worn Bible on the passenger seat. Ray moved the Bible to make room for Mason, handling it with the care of something precious. "My wife gave me that," he explained, noticing Mason's curious glance. "She passed 5 years ago. Breast cancer, same as your mama." Mason felt a sudden connection to this man, a thread of shared loss that bound them together. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Ray shrugged, but his eyes were sad. "It's the hardest thing I ever went through. We never had kids of our own. She wanted them, but it just never happened. I always thought there'd be time, you know. And then there wasn't." He reached into a cooler behind the seats and pulled out a wrapped sandwich, handing it to Mason. Egg and cheese. Made it myself this morning. Eat up." Mason devoured the sandwich in about 30 seconds, barely tasting it. Ray watched him with a mixture of anger and compassion, anger directed at whatever monster had let this child go hungry. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Ray asked. Mason had to think about it. "The pizza, a few weeks ago." Ray shook his head slowly. "Lord have mercy." He pulled out another sandwich and handed it over. "Slow down this time. You'll make yourself sick." They sat in the cab as the sun climbed higher and the truck stop came to life around them. Ray asked questions, gentle, probing questions about Mason's situation. Where was the farmhouse? Did anyone else know about the abuse? Had Mason ever told a teacher or a doctor? Mason answered as honestly as he could. He told Ray about Mrs. Patterson and her granola bars, about the social worker who came and went, about the lies he told to protect himself, and the shame he felt for telling them. "It's not your fault," Ray said firmly. "None of this is your fault. You understand that?" Mason nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. He had spent so long blaming himself, wondering what he had done wrong to make Frank hate him, that the idea of innocence seemed foreign. "What happens now?" Mason asked. "Are you going to take me somewhere?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "I want to help you, Mason. God knows I do. But I can't just drive off with you. That would make me a kidnapper in the eyes of the law, even if I'm trying to save you. We need to do this the right way." "The right way didn't work before," Mason said bitterly. "The social worker believed Frank. They always believed Frank. Maybe they did. But that doesn't mean we give up. It means we find someone who won't be fooled." Ray pulled out his phone, an older model with a cracked screen. "I know a woman lives in Des Moines. Used to be a social worker herself before she retired. She helps kids like you, kids who fall through the cracks. Maybe she can point us in the right direction." He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, speaking in low tones. Mason couldn't hear what was being said, but he watched Ray's face for clues. The trucker nodded several times, his expression growing more determined. "Okay," Ray said finally, ending the call. "Here's the plan. My friend Margaret, she's going to meet us in Des Moines this afternoon. She knows people, the right kind of people. They'll make sure Frank can't hurt you anymore." Mason felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by fear. "What if they don't believe me either?" Ray put a hand on Mason's shoulder. "Margaret's not like those other people. She's seen too much to be fooled by a smooth talker, and if she needs proof, well—" He gestured at Mason's face, where the fading bruises told their own story. "I think the proof is pretty clear." Des Moines was 2 hours away by highway. Ray explained that he had a delivery to make there anyway. A load of farm equipment destined for a dealer on the south side of the city. Taking Mason along wouldn't raise any suspicions, and it would give them time to talk. As the red Peterbilt pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto Highway 20, Mason felt something shift inside him. He was leaving Cedar Falls, leaving Frank, leaving everything he had known. The farmhouse receded in the side mirror until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon, and then it was gone entirely. "You okay?" Ray asked, glancing over at his small passenger. Mason considered the question. His ribs still ached, his eye was still swollen, and his heart was still heavy with grief and fear. But for the first time in years, he felt like he might actually be okay someday. "I think so," he said. Ray nodded and turned his attention back to the road. The engine hummed beneath them, a steady rhythm that seemed to promise safety and movement and change. Outside the window, Iowa rolled by in shades of brown and gray, fields waiting for spring, and towns huddled against the cold. "Tell me about yourself," Ray said. "What do you like to do?" Mason had to think about that. It had been so long since anyone asked him a question that wasn't an accusation. "I like to read," he said finally, "and I like watching shows about trucks." "That's how I knew to come to the truck stop." Ray laughed, a warm sound that filled the cab. "Is that right? Well, you came to the right place then. I've been driving trucks for 30 years. Started when I was not much older than you, helping my daddy with his rig." "Your dad was a trucker too?" "Yes, sir. Mitchell Transport, that's what it says on the side of this truck. That was his company. Just him and one truck back then, hauling whatever needed hauling. When he passed, I took over, built it up to a fleet of 20 trucks before I sold most of it off. Now it's just me and old Red here. Ray patted the dashboard affectionately. She's been with me for 15 years. We've seen every state in the country together, driven through hurricanes and blizzards and everything in between. She's more than a truck to me, she's a partner. Mason looked around the cab with new appreciation. Every item, every photograph, every scratch and wear mark told a story. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was a home on wheels, a testament to a life spent in motion. "Don't you get lonely?" Mason asked. "Being on the road all the time?" Ray considered the question. "Sometimes, especially since my wife passed. But the road has its own kind of company. The other truckers, the people you meet at diners and rest stops, the folks you deliver to. Everyone's got a story, and if you take the time to listen, you're never really alone." He pointed to one of the photographs on the dashboard. It showed a younger Ray with his arm around a smiling woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "That's my Martha. She used to ride with me sometimes before she got sick. We'd drive all night and watch the sunrise together. Best times of my life." Mason thought of his own mother, her face fading in his memory despite the photograph in his pocket. "I don't remember much about my mom," he admitted. "Just bits and pieces. Sometimes I'm scared I'll forget her completely." "You won't," Ray said gently. "The people we love, they become part of us. You carry her with you every day, even when you don't realize it. The way you smile, the way you think, the things you care about, that's her living on through you." The words settled into Mason's heart like seeds finding fertile soil. He hadn't thought about it that way before, that his mother could still be with him even though she was gone. It was a comforting thought, one he wanted to hold on to. The highway stretched ahead of them, straight and endless. Other trucks passed going the opposite direction, their drivers acknowledging Ray with a wave or a flash of lights. It was a secret language, a brotherhood of the road that Mason was just beginning to understand. "What will happen to Frank?" Mason asked eventually. "Will he go to jail?" Ray's jaw tightened. "I hope so. Men like him, they deserve to answer for what they've done, but even if they don't lock him up, they'll make sure he can't hurt you anymore. You'll go somewhere safe, somewhere with people who actually care about you. Like foster care? Maybe. Or maybe they'll find some family you don't know about, an aunt or uncle or grandparent who'd be happy to take you in. Margaret's good at tracking down relatives." Mason thought about the possibility of family he had never met. His mother had mentioned a sister once, an aunt who lived somewhere out west. But she and Mason's mother had had a falling out years ago, and they hadn't spoken since. Could there really be someone out there who would want him? "What if no one wants me?" The question slipped out before Mason could stop it, voicing his deepest fear. Ray looked at him with something like surprise. "Not want you? Mason, you're a smart, brave kid who survived something terrible. Anyone would be lucky to have you. Don't let Frank's voice in your head tell you different. He's wrong about everything, including you." Mason wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that he was worth something, that his future held more than fear and loneliness. But the doubts were deep, planted by years of neglect and cruelty. They wouldn't disappear overnight. "How about some music?" Ray reached for the radio dial. "I've got a rule on long drives. No sadness allowed while the tunes are playing." Country music filled the cab, a cheerful song about summer roads and old trucks. Ray tapped his fingers on the steering wheel and hummed along, his deep voice surprisingly melodic. Mason found himself smiling, despite everything, caught up in the unexpected joy of the moment. For the next hour, they drove in companionable silence, punctuated by Ray's occasional commentary on the passing landscape. He knew every town they passed, every landmark and shortcut and good place to grab a meal. Iowa was mapped in his mind like an old friend, every quirk and character memorized. "See that grain elevator?" Ray pointed to a towering structure beside the road. "I helped build that back in '78. Summer job to pay for trucking school. Hottest 3 months of my life. Thought I was going to melt right into the concrete. You must have seen a lot of changes, Mason said. More than you can imagine. When I started trucking, we didn't have GPS or cell phones or any of that. Just paper maps and CB radios. You had to know the roads by heart, had to trust your instincts. Now the trucks practically drive themselves. He shook his head. I'm not complaining. Progress is progress. But sometimes I miss the old days when driving was an adventure instead of a job. The Des Moines skyline appeared on the horizon. A cluster of buildings rising from the plains like a modern-day castle. Mason had never been to a city before, not a real one. The tallest building in Cedar Falls was the water tower. It's so big, he breathed. Ray laughed. This is nothing. Wait until you see Chicago or New York. Buildings so tall you can't see the tops from the street. People everywhere, rushing around like ants. It's overwhelming the first time, but you get used to it. They pulled off the highway and navigated through the city streets. Mason pressed his face against the window, taking in the shops and restaurants and people going about their daily lives. Everything seemed so normal, so ordinary. He wondered if any of them knew how lucky they were to walk around without fear, to eat whenever they wanted, to sleep without dreading the morning. Ray pulled into the parking lot of a diner called Margaret's Place. It was a small building with bright windows and a neon sign that flickered in the midday light. Several trucks were parked outside, their engines silent. This is it, Ray said, cutting the engine. Margaret runs this place now. Best pie in 3 states, if you ask me. They climbed out of the truck and headed for the entrance. Mason's legs felt weak, partly from sitting so long and partly from nerves. He was about to meet the woman who might determine his entire future. What if she didn't believe him? What if she sent him back to Frank? Ray must have sensed his anxiety because he put a reassuring hand on Mason's shoulder. Margaret's on your side. She's been on the side of kids like you her whole life. Trust me. The door jingled as they pushed it open, releasing a wave of warmth and delicious smells. The diner was cozy, with red vinyl booths and a long counter where several customers sat nursing cups of coffee. A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Her face was lined with age, but also with kindness, the wrinkles of someone who had spent a lifetime smiling. "Ray Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "About time you showed your face around here. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never, Maggie." Ray bent down to kiss her cheek. "Got someone I'd like you to meet. This here's Mason Cooper." Margaret's eyes turned to Mason, taking in his appearance with a single sweeping glance. Whatever she saw there made her expression soften, though the steel in her eyes remained. "Hello, Mason," she said gently. "I hear you've had a rough time of it. How about we sit down and have some pie while you tell me about it?" She led them to a booth in the back corner, away from the other customers. Mason slid in beside Ray, grateful for the trucker's solid presence. A waitress appeared with 3 slices of apple pie and glasses of milk, setting them down without being asked. "Eat," Margaret commanded. "Nobody thinks straight on an empty stomach." Mason didn't need to be told twice. The pie was incredible, sweet and cinnamony with a flaky crust that melted on his tongue. He had to force himself to eat slowly, remembering Ray's warning about making himself sick. "Now then," Margaret said, folding her hands on the table. "Ray told me some of what's been going on, but I'd like to hear it from you in your own words. Can you do that for me, honey?" Mason looked at Ray, who nodded encouragingly. Then he began to talk. It was easier the second time, telling his story. The words flowed more smoothly, the memories less painful to revisit. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing of what she was thinking. Only her eyes gave her away, growing harder and more determined with each detail. When Mason finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "Mason, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to you was not your fault. Frank is a bad man who did bad things, and he's going to answer for them, but you survived. You're here right now telling your story. That took more courage than most grown men have. Mason's eyes welled up with tears. He had needed someone to say those words for so long that hearing them felt like coming home after a long journey. I know some people, Margaret continued. Good people who make sure kids like you end up in safe homes. It's going to take a little time, and there might be some hard days ahead, but I promise you, Mason, I promise on my life, you will never go back to that farmhouse. Frank will never hurt you again. Ray squeezed Mason's shoulder. I told you, she was the real deal. Margaret pulled out her phone, the same kind of old flip phone that Ray had. I'm going to make some calls. You finish your pie and let Ray tell you some of his road stories. Lord knows he's got enough of them. She slid out of the booth and walked toward the back of the diner, already dialing. Mason watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of hope and exhaustion. For the first time in years, someone was fighting for him. Someone believed him. It was almost too much to process. She's something else, isn't she? Ray said proudly. I met her about 20 years ago when I was making a delivery in this area. She was still working for the state then, handling child welfare cases. Toughest woman I ever met, but with a heart the size of Texas. How did she end up running a diner? She retired about 10 years back. Couldn't stand sitting around doing nothing, so she bought this place. But she never really stopped helping kids. She's got connections all over the state, people who owe her favors. When a case falls through the cracks, she's there to catch it. Mason looked around the diner with new eyes. It seemed so ordinary, just another roadside stop for truckers and travelers. But beneath the surface, it was something more. A safe house, a headquarters, a place where lost children could be found. Why does she do it? Mason asked. Why does she care so much? Ray's expression grew sad. She had a daughter once. Same situation as you, more or less. Bad home, worse stepfather. Maggie was young then, didn't have the resources or the knowledge to get her daughter out. By the time she did, it was too late. The girl ran away and never came back. Maggie doesn't know if she's alive or dead. Mason felt a chill run through him, despite the warmth of the diner. That's terrible. It is. But she turned her pain into purpose. She couldn't save her own daughter, but she saved hundreds of other kids over the years, made sure they didn't fall through the cracks like her little girl did. Margaret returned to the booth, her expression triumphant. Okay, here's the situation. I've got a friend at the Department of Human Services who's going to open a case first thing tomorrow morning. Another friend at the sheriff's office is going to pay a visit to that farmhouse tonight, make sure Frank can't leave town. And a third friend at the county attorney's office is going to make sure the charges stick this time. She turned to Mason. You're going to need to tell your story again, probably more than once, to police officers and social workers and maybe a judge. Can you do that? Mason nodded, feeling stronger than he had in years. Yes, ma'am. Good boy. Margaret's smile was warm but fierce. Tonight you'll stay here with me. I've got a spare room upstairs, clean sheets and a warm bed. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. But for now, you're safe. You understand? You're safe. The word echoed in Mason's mind like a bell. Safe. He hadn't felt safe in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. But sitting in this booth, surrounded by these two people who barely knew him but were willing to fight for him, he began to remember. Ray cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. I should be getting on the road. Got that delivery to make, and then another one in Omaha tomorrow morning. Mason felt a pang of disappointment. He had only known the trucker for a few hours, but already Ray felt like the closest thing to a father he had ever had. The thought of him leaving was harder than expected. Will I see you again? Mason asked, hating how small his voice sounded. Ray reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. It was worn and creased, with a phone number printed in faded ink. Mitchell Transport, he said. That's me. You call any time you want, day or night. I might be on the road, but I always have my phone. And next time I'm passing through Des Moines, I'll stop by and check on you. That's a promise. He stuck out his hand, and Mason shook it. The trucker's grip was firm but gentle, a handshake between equals. You're going to be okay, Mason. Better than okay. You're going to have a good life. I can see it in you. Ray stood up and nodded to Margaret. "Take care of him, Maggie. You know I will." The trucker walked out of the diner without looking back. Mason watched through the window as he climbed into the red Peterbilt, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. The truck joined the flow of traffic and disappeared down the road, carrying a piece of Mason's heart with it. "He's a good man," Margaret said softly. "One of the best I know. He'll keep his promise." Mason turned back to face her, this fierce old woman who had taken him under her wing. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we do the hard part. We build a case against Frank that no smooth talking can break. We find you a place to live, somewhere with people who will treat you the way you deserve to be treated, and we start healing. That last part takes the longest, I won't lie to you, but it's the most important part." She stood up and gathered the empty pie plates. "Come on, let me show you your room. Let me show you your... You look like you could use about 12 hours of sleep." Mason followed her through the kitchen and up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The room she led him to was small but cheerful, with yellow walls and a window overlooking the parking lot. A quilt covered the bed, hand-stitched in a pattern of stars and moons. "Bathrooms down the hall," Margaret said. "There are towels in the closet if you want to take a shower. And Mason..." She waited until he met her eyes. "Lock the door if it makes you feel safer. Nobody's going to mind." He nodded, throat too tight to speak. Margaret smiled and left him alone. Mason stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, not quite believing this was real. A few hours ago, he had been hiding in Frank's house, terrified of every sound, counting down the minutes until the next blow fell. Now, he was in a warm room with a soft bed, and people were promising to keep him safe. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, Ray was driving his truck, moving toward the next delivery, the next adventure. And somewhere behind him, Frank was probably waking up from his drunken stupor, realizing that Mason was gone. "Let him realize," Mason thought. "Let him wonder where I went. He can't hurt me anymore." He took a shower, the first hot shower he'd had in weeks. He stood under the spray until the water ran cold, letting it wash away the fear and the grime and the memories. When he got out, he found a set of clean pajamas folded on the bed, along with a note in Margaret's handwriting. "Sleep well. Tomorrow is a new day." Mason crawled under the quilt and closed his eyes. He expected the nightmares to come the way they always did. But instead, he dreamed of trucks rolling down endless highways, of sunrises over mountains and sunsets over oceans, of a world that was bigger and kinder than he had ever imagined. When he woke the next morning, he was still smiling. The investigation into Frank Cooper moved faster than anyone expected. Margaret's friends were as good as she promised, and within a week Frank was in custody, facing charges of child abuse and neglect. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of Mason's injuries, testimony from teachers who had noticed something wrong, records of the social worker's visit that had been mysteriously mishandled. Mason had to tell his story several times, to police detectives and child welfare investigators, and finally to a judge in family court. Each telling was hard, but also a little easier. The more he talked about what had happened, the less power it had over him. The secrets that had weighed him down for years were finally out in the open, exposed to the light. Through it all, Margaret was by his side. She took him to every appointment, sat with him through every interview, made sure he ate 3 meals a day and got enough sleep at night. The spare room above the diner became his home, a sanctuary where he could heal without fear. And true to his word, Ray stopped by whenever he was in the area. He would pull his red Peterbilt into the parking lot and come inside for pie and coffee, regaling Mason with stories from the road. He brought gifts too, a baseball cap from a truck stop in Wyoming, a snow globe from Yellowstone, a miniature model truck that Mason kept on his nightstand. "You're looking better," Ray said on one of these visits, about a month after they had first met. "Got some color in your cheeks. Putting on weight." Mason grinned. "Margaret won't let me leave the table until I've cleaned my plate." I think I've eaten more pie in the last month than in my whole life before. That's Maggie for you. Food is her love language. They were sitting in their usual booth, watching the afternoon traffic pass by. Mason had started helping out around the diner, washing dishes and sweeping floors, earning his keep in a way that made him feel useful. Margaret paid him in ice cream sundaes and extra slices of pie, which seemed like a more than fair exchange. "I've got some news for you," Ray said, his tone becoming more serious. "About your family." Mason's heart skipped a beat. Margaret had mentioned that she was looking into his background, searching for relatives who might be willing to take him in, but he hadn't allowed himself to hope for too much. The possibility of real family, people who actually wanted him, seemed too good to be true. "My friend at the state records office tracked down your mother's sister. Her name's Carol. She lives in Colorado, outside of Denver, married, 2 kids of her own." "My Aunt Carol," Mason said slowly. "Mom mentioned her once. She said they had a fight and stopped talking." "That's right. Something about Carol not approving of your mother's marriage to Frank. She tried to warn her, apparently, but your mom wouldn't listen. By the time she realized Carol was right, she was too proud to reach out." Ray leaned forward. "Here's the thing, Mason. Carol never forgot about you. She's been trying to find you for years, ever since your mother passed. But Frank covered his tracks pretty well, listed you as homeschooled, kept you away from anyone who might ask questions. Carol didn't even know where you were until Margaret's friend made some inquiries. Does she want me?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Ray smiled. "She's on her way here right now. Should arrive by tomorrow morning. She wants to meet you, see if you're open to coming to live with her family." Mason didn't know what to feel. Joy and terror and hope and doubt all swirled together, making it hard to breathe. An aunt, a real family, people who had been looking for him, who had wanted him all along. "What if she doesn't like me?" he asked. "What if her kids don't want me around?" "That's something you'll have to work out together," Ray said honestly. "I'm not going to lie to you and say it'll be easy. Building a new family never is. But Carol sounds like a good woman, and she's traveled a long way to meet you. That has to count for something." That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed under the quilt of stars and moons, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what tomorrow would bring. In his mind, Aunt Carol shifted from an angel to a monster and back again, her face a blur he couldn't quite make out. He thought about his mother, about what she would say if she were here. She had loved Carol once, before the fight that drove them apart. Maybe she had regretted that fight, had wished for reconciliation that came too late. Maybe this was her way of making things right, from wherever she was now. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. Mason got up and opened it to find Margaret standing there in her bathrobe, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. "Mind if I join you?" They sat on the bed together, sipping their drinks in comfortable silence. Outside, the city lights glowed against the night sky, a far cry from the darkness of the farmhouse. "I was scared too," Margaret said eventually, "when I first started helping kids. Scared I'd mess it up, scared I'd make things worse instead of better. But I learned something over the years. Fear doesn't go away. It just gets quieter when you face it. What if Aunt Carol isn't what I hope she is?" Margaret considered the question. "Then we'll figure something else out. You're not going anywhere you don't want to go, Mason. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have a say in it. This is your life and you get to choose." The words settled over him like a warm blanket. He had a say. He had choices. For so long, his life had been dictated by Frank's moods and rages. The idea that he could decide things for himself was still new, still strange. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Margaret patted his hand. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got a long road ahead, but we'll walk it together. That's what family does." She left him then, and somehow her words made sleep easier to find. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Mason dressed carefully, choosing his cleanest clothes and combing his hair until it lay flat. He wanted to make a good impression, to show Aunt Carol that he was worth taking a chance on. She arrived around 10 o'clock, driving a dusty SUV with Colorado plates. Mason watched from the window as she parked and got out, his heart hammering in his chest. She was tall, with the same brown hair as his mother and the same warm smile. She looked nervous too, he realized. Her hands were shaking as she pushed open the diner door. Margaret made the introductions, keeping things simple and calm. Carol and Mason sat across from each other in the booth, neither quite sure what to say. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of separation and missed chances. "You look so much like your mother," Carol finally said, her voice trembling. "I see her in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself. It's like she's right here with us." Mason swallowed hard. "I have a picture of her. Want to see it?" He pulled the photograph from his pocket, the one he had found in the shed. Carol took it with reverent hands, tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at her sister, young and laughing and full of life. "I remember this day," she whispered. "It was her birthday. She was so happy." She looked up at Mason. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. I tried to find you, I swear I did. But by the time I tracked you down, your stepfather had moved you to that farmhouse, and I couldn't—" "It's okay," Mason heard himself say. "You're here now." Carol reached across the table and took his hand. "I want you to come home with me, Mason. I want to give you the life your mother would have wanted for you. I know it won't be easy, and I know it'll take time for us to become a real family, but I'm willing to try, if you are." Mason looked at her. This woman who was a stranger, and yet somehow familiar, who carried pieces of his mother in her face and voice and gestures. He thought about the farmhouse, about Frank, about all the years of fear and loneliness. Then he thought about the truck stop, about Ray and his stories, about Margaret and her fierce protection. He thought about his mother, smiling in the photograph, hoping for a future her son might never have. "I'm willing to try," he said. Carol's face broke into a smile, and suddenly she was around the table, wrapping him in a hug that smelled like lavender and home. Mason hugged her back, awkwardly at first, then tighter as something inside him began to heal. Margaret watched from the counter, wiping her eyes with a dish towel. Outside, a red Peterbilt pulled into the parking lot, and Ray climbed out of the cab, a wrapped present under his arm. "Am I too late for the reunion?" he called, pushing through the door. Mason ran to meet him, and Ray swept him up in a bear hug that lifted him off his feet. "Heard the news," the trucker said. "Had to come see for myself. You did good, kid, real good." The next few hours were a blur of introductions and conversations and plans. Carol told Mason about his cousins, Jake and Emma, who were excited to meet him. She showed him pictures of the house in Colorado, with its big backyard and mountain views. She promised him a room of his own, decorated however he wanted, with a view of the sunset. "And there's a school nearby," she said, "with great teachers. You'll make friends in no time." Mason listened to it all, trying to absorb the reality of this new life that was waiting for him. It seemed impossible that only a month ago he had been trapped in that farmhouse with no hope of escape. Now he had an aunt, cousins, a future that stretched out before him like an open road. Before Carol and Mason left for Colorado, there was one more thing to do. Margaret closed the diner for the afternoon and gathered everyone in the back booth for what she called a proper farewell. There was pie, of course, and cake, and more food than Mason could possibly eat. Ray presented his gift, a brand-new backpack, bright red like his truck, filled with books and snacks for the long drive. "For the road," he said. "Every journey needs supplies." Margaret gave him a photo album, filled with pictures from the past month. There was Mason washing dishes, Mason eating pie, Mason laughing at one of Ray's jokes. There was the diner at sunset and the parking lot at dawn. There were the people who had saved his life, preserved forever in glossy snapshots. "You come back and visit whenever you want," Margaret said. "This place will always be here for you, and so will I." Mason hugged her tight, not caring that he was crying. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. You don't need to thank me, honey. Just go live a good life. That's all the thanks I need." The drive to Colorado took 2 days. Carol drove carefully, stopping often to stretch their legs and take in the scenery. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the years they had lost. Carol told stories about Mason's mother, about their childhood together, about the dreams they had shared. Mason told her about his own life, the good memories and the bad. He talked about the books he had read and the trucks he had watched, about Mrs. Patterson and her granola bars, about the night he had walked to the truck stop and met a stranger who changed everything. "Ray sounds like a good man," Carol said. "He saved my life." "So did you, in a way. It took a lot of courage to ask for help. Most kids in your situation never do." Mason thought about that. It was strange to think of himself as brave. He had felt so helpless for so long, so powerless against Frank's cruelty, but he had done something in the end. He had taken a chance, and it had paid off. They crossed into Colorado on the second evening, the mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. Mason had never seen anything so beautiful. The peaks were white with snow, stark against the blue sky, and the air that came through the cracked window was crisp and clean. "Welcome home," Carol said, and the words felt right. The house was even better than the pictures. It was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a red barn out back. Jake and Emma were waiting on the steps, bouncing with excitement, and they rushed to greet Mason the moment the car pulled into the driveway. "We've been waiting forever," Emma said. She was 8 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "Come see your room. We helped decorate it." Mason let himself be pulled into the house and up the stairs to a room that overlooked the mountains. The walls were painted blue, his favorite color, and there was a model truck on the shelf that looked just like Ray's Peterbilt. A quilt covered the bed, different from Margaret's, but just as warm and welcoming. "Do you like it?" Jake asked anxiously. He was 10, the same age as Mason, with Carol's brown hair and serious eyes. "Mom said you liked trucks, so we found that model at the store. And the quilt was Grandma's, but she said you could have it." Mason didn't know what to say. He looked around the room, at the careful decorations and the thoughtful touches, and felt something loosen in his chest. These people, who didn't even know him, had gone to so much trouble to make him feel welcome. "I love it," he said. "Thank you." Jake's face broke into a grin. "Cool. Want to see the barn? We've got horses. Mom said maybe you could learn to ride if you want." Mason followed his cousin out of the room, down the stairs, and into the Colorado sunshine. The barn smelled like hay and horses, a warm, earthy scent that was nothing like the musty decay of Frank's shed. Jake introduced him to the horses one by one: Thunder, who was black and proud, Sunny, who was gentle and golden, and Star, who was small and perfect for beginners. "You can ride Star," Jake said. "She's really patient. I was scared of her at first, but now we're best friends." Mason reached out to touch Star's nose, feeling the soft warmth of her breath against his palm. The horse whickered gently and nuzzled his hand, as if welcoming him to the family. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Mason wasn't used to having people around him who cared, who asked how he was feeling and actually wanted to know the answer. He flinched at sudden movements and hoarded food under his bed, habits born of survival that took time to unlearn. But slowly, gradually, he began to relax. Carol was patient and understanding, never pushing him to talk before he was ready, always there when he needed her. Jake and Emma treated him like a brother, including him in their games and fights and inside jokes. Even the horses seemed to sense that he was fragile, moving gently around him as if he might break. He started school in January, nervous and terrified of being the new kid. But his teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, was kind and welcoming, and by the end of the first week, Mason had made a friend. His name was Danny, and he was obsessed with trucks just like Mason. They spent recess talking about different models and comparing their favorite trucking shows. "My uncle's a trucker," Danny said one day. "He drives for a big company out of Denver. Maybe he could take us for a ride sometime." Mason thought about Ray, about the red Peterbilt and the endless highway. "I know a trucker, too," he said. "His name's Ray. He saved my life." Danny's eyes went wide. Seriously? That's so cool. You have to tell me the whole story. So Mason told him. Not all of it, not the darkest parts, but enough. He told him about the truck stop and the long drive to Des Moines, about Margaret's diner and the pie that tasted like hope. He told him about asking a stranger for help and having that stranger become a hero. Wow, Danny said when he finished. That's like something out of a movie. It felt like a movie too, Mason admitted. Like I was watching it happen to someone else. Ray came to visit in March, his red Peterbilt looking out of place on the quiet country road. Jake and Emma were fascinated by the truck, climbing all over the cab while Ray laughed and pointed out the various features. Carol invited him to stay for dinner, and they all gathered around the big table in the kitchen, passing dishes and telling stories like a real family. "You've got a good thing here," Ray said to Mason later, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "A real good thing." "I know," Mason said. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. I keep waiting to wake up back in that farmhouse." Ray put a hand on his shoulder. "It's real, and you earned it, every bit. Don't let anyone tell you different." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the evening, the horses moving in the barn, the kids laughing inside the house, the wind whispering through the pine trees. "I'm thinking of retiring," Ray said eventually. "Selling old Red, settling down somewhere. I'm getting too old for the road." Mason felt a pang of sadness. "You love driving? You've said so 100 times. "I do, but there's more to life than just driving. I've been thinking about what Margaret said, about how she turned her pain into purpose. Maybe I could do something like that. Help kids who are in the same situation you were in. I've got connections all over the country, truckers who would keep an eye out for children in trouble. Like a network? Something like that." Ray smiled. "Margaret's been after me for years to join her operation. Maybe it's time I listened." The idea of Ray giving up his truck was bittersweet. But Mason understood. There were so many kids out there who needed help, who were trapped in situations they couldn't escape on their own. If Ray could be for them what he had been for Mason, it would be worth it. "I think that's a great idea," Mason said. Yeah, you'd be really good at it." Ray's smile widened. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot." The months passed, and Mason's new life took shape. He got good grades in school and made more friends. He learned to ride Star and helped Carol in the garden on weekends. He had birthday parties and sleepovers and all the normal childhood experiences he had been denied before. Frank was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mason didn't attend the trial, but Carol told him about it afterward. The judge had been harsh, the evidence overwhelming. Frank would not be hurting anyone else for a long time. Mason didn't feel happy when he heard the news. He didn't feel much of anything, really. Frank was part of his past now, a dark chapter in a story that was still being written. He had more important things to focus on, like the present and the future. Ray did retire eventually, selling the red Peterbilt to a young trucker just starting out. He bought a small house in Des Moines, close to Margaret's diner, and threw himself into the work of helping children in trouble. He called it the Mitchell Network, a loose coalition of truckers and social workers and ordinary citizens who kept their eyes open for kids who needed saving. Mason visited him every summer, spending a week at Margaret's diner eating pie and listening to Ray's stories. The spare room was still there, still decorated with its yellow walls and star and moon quilt, a reminder of the night he had first slept safe. "You've gotten so tall," Margaret said on one of these visits, when Mason was 12 and almost eye level with her. "Before long, you'll be towering over all of us." "Carol says I'll be as tall as my dad," Mason said. "She showed me pictures. He was really tall." "That he was. Your mother used to joke that she needed a ladder just to kiss him." They laughed together, sharing memories of people they had lost but never forgotten. Mason still carried the photograph from the shed, though it was faded now from handling. He had others too, pictures from Colorado of his new life, but that original one, of his mother young and happy, would always be his most precious possession. The years continued to pass. Mason graduated from middle school, then high school, always with Carol and Jake and Emma cheering in the audience. He decided to become a social worker, inspired by Margaret's example and Ray's dedication. He wanted to help kids like himself, to be the hero that appeared when hope seemed lost. He went to college in Denver, studying hard and making friends who didn't know about his past. He learned to trust people in ways he never had before. During his junior year, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at 92. She left Mason the star and moon quilt with a note. Even in the darkest night, the stars are still shining. Love, always, Margaret. Ray lived another 10 years, long enough to see Mason graduate with his master's degree and take a job at a child welfare agency in Colorado. At the graduation, Ray hugged him and said the words Mason never tired of hearing, "You did good, kid. Real good." Ray passed away that winter, peacefully, with Mason by his side. Mason inherited the model truck and put it on his desk at work, a reminder of the day a scared little boy asked a stranger for help. Miracles did happen. Not the supernatural kind, not magic or fate or divine intervention, but the human kind. The miracles born of courage and kindness, and the simple act of showing up when someone needed you. Mason had been saved by a trucker, a retired social worker, and an aunt who never stopped looking. He had been saved by Mrs. Patterson's granola bars and Margaret's pie, by Ray's stories and Carol's patience. He had been saved in the end by himself, by the tiny spark of hope he had refused to let die, even when everything seemed lost. Now it was his turn to save others. He worked at the agency for 30 years, rising from caseworker to supervisor to director. He built a reputation for being tough but fair, for refusing to give up on cases that others dismissed as hopeless. He took in foster kids who had nowhere else to go, some of whom stayed long enough to become part of his family. He married a woman named Sarah, a teacher who understood his mission and supported it completely. They had 2 children, a boy named Ray and a girl named Margaret, in honor of the people who had changed Mason's life. The children grew up hearing stories about truck stops and diners, about a red Peterbilt in the open road, about the power of one person to make a difference. When Mason retired, they threw him a party at the agency. Hundreds of people showed up. Former foster kids now grown with families of their own, colleagues who had worked beside him through decades of triumphs and heartbreaks, friends from all corners of his life. Carol was there, older now, but still sharp, still fierce in her love for the nephew she had rescued so long ago. Jake and Emma were there with their own children, the cousins Mason had never known he had until that fateful day in Des Moines. Sarah was there, and little Ray and Margaret, who weren't so little anymore. They asked him to give a speech, to share some wisdom after a lifetime of service. Mason stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people he loved and people whose lives he had touched, and he thought about where to begin. He thought about the farmhouse in Iowa, the rain on the windows, the fear that had been his constant companion. He thought about the photograph in his pocket, faded now, but still precious. He thought about Ray and Margaret and Carol, the trinity of angels who had appeared when he needed them most. And he thought about the boy he had been, small and scared and desperate, standing in a truck stop parking lot at dawn, summoning the courage to ask a stranger for help. "I used to think heroes were people in capes and costumes," he began. "People with superpowers who swooped in to save the day, but I've learned that the real heroes are the ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. A trucker who stops to listen, a retired social worker who runs a diner, an aunt who never gives up searching, a teacher who shares her lunch with a hungry child." He paused, emotion threatening to overcome him. "Every person in this room has the power to be a hero. Not by doing something grand or spectacular, but by paying attention, by noticing the child who flinches, the teenager who seems lost, the family that's struggling behind closed doors, by asking the question that no one else will ask, 'Are you okay?' Do you need help? He looked at the crowd, at the faces of former foster children and dedicated caseworkers, at friends and family who had walked this journey with him. I was saved because someone saw me, because a trucker at a rest stop took the time to look at a scared little boy and ask what was wrong, because a retired social worker refused to let the system fail another child, because an aunt drove halfway across the country on the hope that her nephew was still alive. We can all be that person for someone else. We can all be the hero who shows up, who listens, who cares. It doesn't take superpowers. It just takes being human. He held up the photograph of his mother, the one from the shed, now preserved in a frame that Carol had given him years ago. My mother died when I was 8 years old. For a long time I thought I had lost her forever, but I've learned that the people we love never really leave us. They live on in the choices we make, the lives we touch, the love we share with others. So when you go home tonight, hug your children, call your parents, reach out to the friend you haven't spoken to in too long, and keep your eyes open for the child who might need saving, because somewhere out there, right now, there's a scared kid standing at a truck stop, trying to summon the courage to ask for help. Be the one who answers. Mason stepped down from the podium to thunderous applause. Sarah was crying, and so were the kids, and so was he. Carol pulled him into a hug that lasted a full minute, whispering words of love and pride into his ear. Later, after the party wound down and the guests went home, Mason drove out to the old cemetery on the edge of town. It had been years since he visited, but he knew the way by heart. His mother's grave was under an oak tree, the headstone weathered but still legible. He sat down on the grass beside it, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face. "I did it, Mom," he said softly. "I made something of my life. I helped people, just like you would have wanted. I found family, and love, and purpose. I survived." He placed the photograph against the headstone, the one of her laughing in front of the shed. It had been with him through everything, a reminder of who she had been and who he could become. "I miss you every day. I wish you could have seen all of this. But I know you're watching somewhere. I know you're proud." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and for a moment Mason could almost hear her voice, gentle and warm, telling him that yes, she was proud, and yes, she loved him, and yes, everything was going to be okay. He sat there until the stars came out, the same stars that had decorated the quilt Margaret gave him so long ago. Then he got to his feet, brushed off his pants, and walked back to his car. The road stretched out before him, endless and full of possibility. There would be more battles to fight, more children to save, more moments of doubt and despair. But there would also be joy and triumph and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Mason drove home as the moon rose over the mountains, thinking about truck stops and diners and the strange journey that had brought him here. He thought about Ray and Margaret, watching over him from wherever heroes went when their work was done. And he thought about the boy he had once been, the boy who had looked at a trucker and asked the question that changed everything. "Can you save me?" The answer, it turned out, was yes. But the saving hadn't come from one person or one moment. It had come from 1,000 small acts of kindness, a lifetime of choices that added up to something beautiful. Mason pulled into his driveway, where Sarah was waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a smile. The kids were inside, arguing over the remote control like kids everywhere. The house was warm and bright, full of the sounds and smells of a family that had chosen each other. He climbed out of the car and walked toward the light, toward his life, toward the future he had built from the ruins of his past. The stars shone overhead, and somewhere on the highway a truck rumbled through the night, carrying hope to wherever it was needed most. The end was just another beginning.